December 7th, 1941. The attack on Pearl Harbor hurled the United States into the chaos of World War II. America, once hesitant to join the global conflict, now mobilized at a scale never before seen in its history. Factories roared with production. Millions enlisted in the armed forces. Families sent sons, fathers, and brothers overseas, unsure if they would ever return. In the deserts of the American Southwest, the news of war reached the Navajo Nation. For centuries, the Navajo people had endured broken promises, poverty, and forced assimilation. Many had attended boarding schools where their language was punished, beaten out of them with rulers, forbidden in classrooms. Yet when their country called, Navajo men stepped forward. They volunteered to serve, determined to protect the very nation that had not always protected them. By 1942, more than 50,000 Native Americans would serve in the U.S. military, an enormous percentage of their population. But from the Navajo Nation came something unique, something unexpected, a language unlike any other in the world. Navajo was complex, tonal, and unwritten. There was no alphabet, no textbooks, and very few non-Navajos could speak or even recognize it. Linguists considered it nearly impossible for outsiders to learn fluently. For military commanders desperate to find a secure way to communicate on the battlefield, this language offered an untapped resource. During the early months of the Pacific War, American forces faced a serious problem. Their codes kept being broken. The Japanese were master cryptographers, skilled at intercepting and deciphering Allied communications. Every time American forces developed a new encryption system, the Japanese found ways to crack it. The cost was measured in lives. Soldiers died, battles were lost, convoys were ambushed, all because the enemy could listen and understand. The US military experimented with complex cipher machines, but they were slow, bulky, and prone to malfunction in the chaos of battle. In combat, time was everything. A delayed message could mean the difference between victory and massacre. Commanders needed a code that was fast, flexible, and, above all, unbreakable. That was when an unlikely idea surfaced. A man named Philip Johnston, the son of missionaries who had lived among the Navajo as a child, proposed using the Navajo language as the basis for a code. Johnston himself spoke Navajo fluently and understood its intricacies. He believed it was perfect for military use. At first, the Marines were skeptical. Could an indigenous language really serve as the backbone of wartime communication? But the more they thought about it, the more it made sense. The Japanese had no exposure to Navajo. There were no Navajo language books, no dictionaries, no radio broadcasts. Even if they captured a Navajo soldier, they would never be able to break the system. The idea was bold, unconventional, and risky. But in war, innovation often comes from the unlikeliest sources. The Marine Corps gave Johnston permission to test his theory. And so began one of the most extraordinary chapters of World War II. A story of language, identity, and courage. A story of how young Navajo men, many barely out of high school, would step onto the world stage armed not with weapons alone, but with words. Words that would change the course of the war. By the summer of 1942, the Marine Corps would recruit the first group of Navajo men, a group that would come to be known as the Original 29. They were about to build a code so strong, so fast, and so secret that it would never be broken. The Navajo Code Talkers were about to make history. In early 1942, just months after Pearl Harbor, Philip Johnston arrived at Camp Elliott in California with a bold proposal. Johnston wasn't a Marine officer or a career soldier. He was a civilian engineer, nearly 50 years old. But he carried an idea that could change the course of the war. He walked into a room of skeptical Marine commanders and explained, "The Navajo language is the answer to your code problem." At first, the Marines didn't know what to make of him. They had heard of Native American languages being used before. During World War I, The Choctaw language had briefly been employed in Europe for secure communications. But Navajo, it sounded far-fetched. Johnston pressed on. He explained that Navajo was unlike any other language in the world. It was tonal, with sounds and structures foreign to English speakers. It had no written form. To outsiders, it sounded like gibberish, a string of unfamiliar syllables impossible to decode. Even if the Japanese captured a Navajo speaker, Johnston insisted, they would never be able to make sense of it. The Marines were intrigued, but still unconvinced. So Johnston arranged a demonstration. He brought 4 Navajo men with him, bilingual speakers who could prove the language's power. In front of the officers, Johnston wrote out a standard military message in English. One Navajo translated it into his language and relayed it across a radio. On the other end, another Navajo translated it back into English. The officers watched in astonishment. The message came back perfectly clear, and far faster than any code machine could have managed. What usually took hours to encrypt and decrypt was now accomplished in minutes. The test was a success. The Marines agreed to try it on a larger scale. In May of 1942, the Marine Corps recruited the first group of Navajo Code Talkers, 29 young men from the reservation. Many were just teenagers, fresh out of high school. Some had never left the Southwest before. They were shepherds, farmers, and students, fluent in a language that the US government had once tried to suppress. Now, that same language would become their greatest weapon. The 29th were sent to Camp Pendleton, California, where they began the painstaking task of developing a workable code. Speaking Navajo alone wasn't enough. They had to adapt it into a system that could handle the complexities of war. They began by creating a phonetic alphabet. Each letter of the English alphabet was assigned a Navajo word. For example, the letter A might be represented by Wolachi, meaning ant. B could be Shush, meaning bear. Using this system, they could spell out names, places, and technical terms. But they didn't stop there. The men created entire vocabularies for military equipment and tactics. Tanks became Chaydagahi, or turtle. Submarines were Beshlo, ironfish. Bombers were Jaysho, buzzard. Machine guns were Ana-Alchi, or rapid-fire guns. Every weapon, every vehicle, every rank and unit was given a Navajo equivalent. The brilliance of the code was its dual-layered security. First, the Japanese couldn't understand Navajo at all. Second, even if they did, the words were being used symbolically. Ironfish didn't literally mean a fish made of iron. It meant submarine. Without knowing the code's internal logic, the words were meaningless. The original 29 built a dictionary of more than 200 code terms. They memorized every word. Nothing was written down. If even one page fell into enemy hands, the system could be compromised. The entire code had to live in their minds, carried by memory alone. Training was grueling. The men practiced for hours, sending and receiving messages over radios, drilling until they could translate instantly without hesitation. Speed and accuracy were everything. In combat, delays could cost lives. By the end of their training, the Navajo Code Talkers could encode, transmit, and decode a 3-line message in just 20 seconds. By comparison, machines of the era took 30 minutes to do the same. The Marines were stunned. What they had witnessed was revolutionary. When the training was complete, the 29 were deployed to the Pacific. They carried their code into battle, untested and unproven, with the weight of secrecy on their shoulders. If they succeeded, the United States would gain a weapon unlike any other. If they failed, thousands of lives could be lost. But the Navajo men did not fail. As the war moved into its bloodiest years, the Code Talkers would prove themselves time and time again. Their code was unbreakable. Their transmissions, lightning fast. The system worked exactly as Johnston had promised, and even better than commanders had imagined. Yet the Navajo Code Talkers were not just translators. They were Marines. They trained with rifles, marched in formation, dug foxholes, and faced the same brutal combat conditions as every soldier around them. Their mission was secret, but their courage was no less real. By the time the first battles came, the Navajo Code was ready, and so were the men who carried it. The war in the Pacific was about to change. In August 1942, the United States launched its first major offensive in the Pacific, the invasion of Guadalcanal. Jungle-covered, disease-ridden, and heavily defended by Japanese forces, the island became a proving ground for the young Navajo Code Talkers. When the Marines landed, chaos erupted. Communications were critical, but every code the military had used up to that point had been compromised. The Japanese were expert code breakers. They intercepted messages, deciphered orders, and used the information to ambush Allied forces. The Marines needed something different, something the enemy could not crack. That's when the Navajo Code Talkers stepped forward. Their voices crackled across radios under enemy fire. Orders for artillery strikes, troop movements, and supply requests were relayed in Navajo. Within minutes, commanders received clear instructions, far faster than any cipher machine could deliver. For the first time, Japanese cryptographers were baffled. They could hear the messages, but the language was so alien that it was impossible to understand. They had broken every other American code, but Navajo was impenetrable. The Japanese never solved it. At Guadalcanal, the Navajo proved their worth. The Marines were able to coordinate attacks with unprecedented speed and accuracy. Commanders who had once doubted the strange experiment were now convinced. The Code Talkers were indispensable. From that point on, the Navajo were at the heart of nearly every major battle in the Pacific. Bougainville, Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, and perhaps most famously, Iwo Jima. Life on Guadalcanal was brutal. The Code Talkers carried heavy radios through dense jungle, mud, and constant rain. They endured malaria, dysentery, and the constant threat of ambush. The Japanese fought fiercely, launching nighttime assaults and desperate banzai charges. Amid the chaos, the Navajo Code Talkers became lifelines. When units were cut off, their survival depended on those rapid transmissions. Artillery batteries adjusted fire based on Navajo-coded coordinates. Reinforcements moved at the right moment. Supplies reached troops who would have otherwise starved. The Marines quickly realized, when the Navajo spoke, lives were saved. In November 1943, the Marines assaulted Tarawa, a tiny atoll in the Gilbert Islands. The Japanese defenders were dug in, determined to fight to the last man. The battle was one of the bloodiest of the war. In just 76 hours, over 6,000 men were killed. Marines were pinned down on beaches, unable to advance under withering fire. In the chaos, Navajo Code Talkers kept communications alive. One Marine officer later wrote, "Were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Tarawa." Messages that once would have taken hours were transmitted in minutes. The Japanese, listening in, could do nothing but hear a language they could not hope to decode. By 1944, the Code Talker program had expanded. Hundreds of Navajo men now served in Marine divisions. They worked in pairs, one speaking into the radio, the other writing down the decoded message. At Saipan, they transmitted constantly as the battle raged across the island. The system was so fast and reliable that Marine commanders began to depend on it for every major order. The Japanese tried desperately to break the code. They even captured Navajo soldiers, hoping to force them to translate. But those men were not trained code talkers. They knew only the spoken language, not the coded system. The Japanese never got a single useful translation. The code was unbreakable. At Peleliu, the Navajo Code Talkers faced one of the most grueling battles of the war. The island was a fortress of coral ridges and hidden caves. Temperatures soared above 110 degrees. Marines fought yard by yard, suffering staggering casualties. In the middle of it all, the Code Talkers carried their radios through gunfire and explosions. They relayed coordinates for artillery and airstrikes, guiding bombs onto enemy bunkers hidden in the ridges. One Marine later recalled, "Every time we needed artillery, we called the Navajos. They gave us fire on the target faster than anything we had ever seen." The price was high. Many Code Talkers were wounded. Some never returned. But their voices never faltered. Even under fire, even while bleeding, they transmitted. Then came Iwo Jima. On February 19, 1945, the Marines stormed the beaches of the volcanic island. 36 days of brutal combat followed. Japanese defenders, entrenched in tunnels and bunkers, fought to the death. It was one of the bloodiest battles in Marine Corps history. And at its heart were the Navajo Code Talkers. Major Howard Connor, the 5th Marine Division's signal officer, later declared, "Were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima." In the first 48 hours alone, Code Talkers sent over 800 messages. Not one mistake was made. Artillery barrages were coordinated with deadly precision. Airstrikes were guided onto hidden targets. Reinforcements were directed exactly where they were needed. One Code Talker recalled crawling through black volcanic ash, bullets snapping overhead, while speaking calmly into his radio. "Send more Marines to Hill 362. Enemy strong." His voice carried through static, translated instantly, and within minutes, reinforcements were moving. The Navajo Code Talkers worked around the clock, without rest, without hesitation. They were not just transmitting words, they were transmitting survival. When the battle ended, more than 26,000 Americans were killed or wounded. Nearly all of the 21,000 Japanese defenders were dead. But Iwo Jima was taken, and the Navajo Code Talkers had played a decisive role. The Navajo Code Talkers may have been armed with radios and language, but life on the battlefield was never simple. They endured the same hardships as every Marine: hunger, exhaustion, and the constant threat of death. Yet their role carried unique challenges that set them apart, and their experience was both heroic and heartbreaking. From the moment they were recruited, the Code Talkers were told that their mission was top secret. They could not discuss it with friends, with fellow soldiers outside the program, or even with their families back home. If captured, they were to reveal nothing. Secrecy weighed heavily. The men knew that every message they sent could decide the fate of entire units, yet no one around them truly understood what they were doing. To their commanders, they were radio operators. To their fellow Marines, they were simply the Navajo. The full scope of their mission would remain hidden until long after the war ended. That secrecy also came with a chilling order. The code must never fall into enemy hands. In some cases, Marines were assigned as bodyguards to protect the Code Talkers. Their orders were grim. If capture seemed imminent, the guards were to kill their Navajo comrade rather than let him be taken alive. Many Code Talkers knew this. They carried not only radios, but the heavy knowledge that their own brothers in arms might be forced to silence them. The Navajo men also faced suspicion, sometimes from the very Marines they fought beside. To many white soldiers, the Navajo looked unfamiliar, spoke a language no one else understood, and were often mistaken for the enemy. There are accounts of Code Talkers being stopped at gunpoint by fellow Marines who believed they were Japanese infiltrators. One Navajo recalled diving for cover during a firefight, only to find himself staring down the barrel of an American rifle. He was seconds from being shot before a commander intervened and explained his role. Incidents like these were frightening reminders that prejudice had not disappeared, even in the heat of war. Yet the Navajo men persevered, proving themselves again and again through their courage and skill. Over time, respect grew. Many Marines who had once been wary came to trust the Code Talkers completely, relying on their voices as a lifeline in battle. Like every Marine, Code Talkers faced the daily horrors of the Pacific Campaign. They dug foxholes in the mud, marched for miles with blistered feet, and endured endless nights of shellfire. They fought off jungle diseases, swarms of insects, and hunger when supply lines broke down. But unlike other Marines, they carried heavy radio equipment on their backs. Radios of the era were bulky, weighing 30 to 40 pounds, with wires, batteries, and spare parts. Code talkers lugged them through swamps, across beaches, and up rocky ridges. In combat, the radios made them targets. Enemy snipers quickly learned that the men with radios were vital. Kill the radio operator, and you cut off the unit's lifeline. Many code talkers were wounded. Some were killed in action. Yet even under fire, they kept transmitting. Their calm voices carried coordinates, orders, and pleas for reinforcements, often while bullets tore the ground around them. Despite the hardships, the Navajo men drew strength from their culture. Many carried small medicine pouches given to them by elders before leaving home. Some whispered traditional prayers before battles, asking for protection from the spirits of their ancestors. In foxholes and tents, they spoke to each other in Navajo, not just for the code, but for comfort. Hearing their language, the same words spoken at home, in ceremonies and around fires, gave them courage. It reminded them of families waiting back in the desert, of sheep grazing on mesas, of the songs and stories of their people. Sometimes, fellow Marines would listen in, unable to understand but fascinated by the sounds. For the Navajo, speaking their language openly, without fear of punishment, was both strange and empowering. In schools back home, they had been beaten for using it. In war, that same language had become a weapon of victory. The Pacific was a place of horror. At Saipan, Tarawa, and Iwo Jima, code talkers saw things they would never forget. Piles of bodies, the screams of the wounded, the stench of death in the tropical heat. They transmitted messages that sent men into combat, knowing many would never return. For some, the memories never left. After the war, many struggled with what we would now call PTSD. They had nightmares, flashbacks, and survivor's guilt. Some turned to alcohol. Others withdrew in silence. And unlike many veterans, the code talkers could not share their experiences, even with family. Their mission remained classified. They returned home carrying memories too heavy to bear, yet unable to explain why they woke in the night drenched in sweat, or why loud noises made them flinch. Through it all, the code talkers forged unbreakable bonds with their fellow Marines. In foxholes, on beaches, and in jungles, they became brothers. They shared food, water, cigarettes, and jokes. They carried each other when wounded. Many white Marines who had once doubted them later became their fiercest defenders. They saw firsthand that without the code talkers, many battles would have been lost. Respect grew not from speeches, but from survival, from knowing that the calm Navajo voice on the radio had saved their lives. When the war ended, many Marines wrote letters home about our Navajo boys, praising their courage and skill. The friendships lasted decades, even into old age. But at the time, few outside the Pacific knew what the Navajo were doing. Their work was top secret. There were no newspaper headlines, no parades, no recognition. Instead, the code talkers returned home quietly, carrying scars both visible and invisible. They had fought bravely, saved lives, and helped win a war. Yet for decades, no one spoke of them. Their families asked questions. Their children wanted stories. The Navajo veterans gave only silence. For many, that silence was the hardest burden of all. By the summer of 1945, the war in the Pacific reached its violent climax. After the hell of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, American forces prepared for what would have been the bloodiest battle of all, the invasion of Japan itself. But history changed course with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Within weeks, Japan surrendered. The war was over. For the Navajo Code Talkers, victory brought relief, but also a strange kind of emptiness. After years of constant battle, the sudden silence was jarring. They had carried radios through jungle and ash, relayed thousands of life or death messages, and seen the war from its fiercest front lines. Now, it was time to go home. When the fighting stopped, the code talkers laid down their radios and rifles. They packed their gear and boarded ships back to the United States. Many had not seen their families in years. The thought of returning to the mesas, canyons, and deserts of the Navajo Nation filled them with hope. But the Marines had one last order. The code, their language system, their creation, their weapon, was still top secret. They were forbidden from speaking of it. Not to their families, not to their friends, not even to other veterans. The Navajo Code might still be needed in future wars, and so it remained classified. For the code talkers, this order was final. They had fought in some of the most brutal battles of the war, but now they would carry their greatest achievement in silence. The journey home was bittersweet. In small towns and big cities across America, returning veterans were welcomed with parades and medals. But in the Navajo Nation, the celebrations were quieter. Families welcomed their sons back with tears and embraces, but there were no headlines praising their contributions. The young men returned to the lives they had left behind, farming, herding sheep, working in mines, raising families. They came back changed, carrying memories of combat and loss, but unable to explain what they had done. When their children asked about the war, most offered only vague answers. I was a Marine. I served in the Pacific, nothing more. This silence was not just military secrecy. For many, it was also survival. Talking about the horrors of war was too painful. The memories of screams, explosions, and death were locked away, buried deep. As the years passed, history moved on. World War II veterans became known as the Greatest Generation. Stories of D-Day, the Battle of the Bulge, and the flag raising on Iwo Jima filled textbooks and documentaries. But the Navajo Code Talkers were missing from those pages. Because their mission was still classified, their role in the war remained unknown to the public. Even their families often had no idea of the scale of their contribution. Fathers and grandfathers who had saved lives with every transmission kept their silence, blending back into everyday life. Imagine the frustration. To know that you had helped change the course of a global war, yet to sit at a family gathering unable to speak of it, watching the world honor others while your own story stayed hidden. That was the life of the Code Talkers for more than 2 decades. Like many veterans, the Navajo men struggled after the war. Some returned to poverty, finding few opportunities on the reservation. Others carried invisible wounds, nightmares, flashbacks, and survivor's guilt. Some turned to alcohol to dull the pain. Others withdrew, speaking little, haunted by what they had seen. Yet even in their struggles, they kept their oath of silence. The code remained intact. The irony was painful. The same United States government that had once tried to erase the Navajo language had used it to win the war. And now, after the war, the contribution of the Navajo men remained unrecognized. They had given their words to protect a nation that had often denied them a voice. For more than 20 years, the story of the Code Talkers lay hidden. Families carried on, never knowing that their fathers had been part of one of the most ingenious military strategies in history. Historians wrote books about World War II, but the Navajo were absent. Then, in 1968, the US military finally declassified the Navajo Code. For the first time, the truth began to emerge. Veterans who had held their tongues for decades could finally speak. They told their children and grandchildren what they had done. They explained that their voices had guided artillery, that their language had directed Marines on beaches and in jungles, that their words had been weapons. Many listeners were stunned. Families who had assumed their loved ones were ordinary radio operators learned that they had been central to America's victories. The silence lifted, and the stories began to flow. But the long delay meant that recognition came late. Many of the original 29 had already passed away. Countless others never lived to see their contributions acknowledged. For those who survived, the years of secrecy left scars. Some spoke bitterly of how they had been ignored, their sacrifices forgotten. Others spoke with pride, saying they had done their duty and expected nothing in return. What united them all was the knowledge that their language, the very thing that had once been punished in schools, had saved lives and secured victories. The Code Talkers had fought as Marines, bled as Marines, and returned as Marines. But their voices had been different. Their voices had carried a power the enemy could never break. And for decades, those voices were silent. For decades after World War II, the Navajo Code Talkers remained unknown heroes. Their mission had been buried beneath the stamp of classification. But history has a way of finding its voice, and by the late 20th century, the silence began to break. In 1968, the US government finally declassified the Navajo Code. The veil of secrecy was lifted. For the first time, veterans could tell their families the truth. Children and grandchildren listened in awe as old men, many now in their 50s or 60s, revealed that they had once carried radios through gunfire, speaking words that guided battles across the Pacific. News of the Code Talkers began to spread slowly. Local newspapers ran articles. Historians started to record their testimonies. Veterans groups invited them to share their experiences. But recognition came gradually, and often unevenly. For years, the Navajo men remained in the shadow of history. They were proud of what they had accomplished, but many were still reluctant to speak. Some felt that after so long, the world no longer cared. Others had carried their silence for so many decades that speaking now felt unnatural. By the 1980s and 1990s, momentum grew. The story of the Code Talkers appeared in documentaries and history books. Schools began inviting them to speak to students. Tribes across the country celebrated their native heroes, recognizing how their cultural heritage had been vital to Allied victory. The public reaction was often emotional. Audiences listened with tears as these elderly men described battles, fear, and the power of their language. Students who had once thought history was dry now heard it directly from the voices of those who had lived it. The story was personal, human, and unforgettable. The Navajo Nation took pride in their warriors. Monuments were raised. Streets and schools were renamed. In Window Rock, Arizona, the Navajo capital, a memorial was built to honor the Code Talkers. Visitors came from across the country to read the names, see the statues, and remember the voices that had saved lives. At last, the United States government began to formally honor them. In 2000, Congress passed legislation authorizing medals for the Code Talkers. In July 2001, President George W. Bush welcomed the surviving original 29 Code Talkers to Washington, D.C. In a moving ceremony, he presented them with Congressional Gold Medals, the highest honor Congress can bestow. Hundreds of other Code Talkers received silver medals. President Bush spoke directly to them. By using their native language, these proud Navajo men ensured the survival of American troops and the victory of freedom itself. For many of the men, it was the first time they had been publicly thanked by their nation. Families wept. Veterans who had been silent for half a century stood tall, medals shining on their chests. It was long overdue, but it was powerful. The story of the Code Talkers also entered popular culture. Movies, television shows, and novels drew inspiration from their story. While not always historically perfect, these depictions spread awareness to millions who might otherwise never have heard of the Navajo contribution. Schools across America began teaching about them. In classrooms, children learned that a language once punished had become a weapon of victory. For Native American students, the story was a source of pride, a reminder that their cultures and languages carried strength and resilience. As the years passed, the number of surviving code talkers grew smaller. By the early 2000s, only a handful of the original 29 remained alive. Communities rallied to honor them while they still could. Parades were held on reservations. Veterans groups flew them to reunions. Museums recorded their stories on film so that future generations would never forget. Many of the men expressed gratitude for the recognition, but also humility. They had never seen themselves as heroes. They had been Marines doing their duty. What mattered most, they said, was that their language had saved lives, that their words had carried their brothers home. The late recognition could never erase the decades of silence, but it gave the code talkers their rightful place in history. No longer were they anonymous voices on radios. They were remembered as warriors of words, guardians of a code that was never broken. The world now knew what the Japanese never could, that in the darkest hours of war, the Navajo language had been a shield of victory. The story of the Navajo Code Talkers is more than a military tale. It is a story of resilience, of identity, and of the unlikeliest of heroes. When the world was at war, America turned to a people it had long tried to silence. For decades, the Navajo language had been suppressed in boarding schools, punished out of classrooms, and dismissed as irrelevant to the modern world. Yet in the Pacific, that same language became the strongest weapon in the US arsenal. The irony is striking. What others had sought to erase, the Navajo preserved. And in preserving it, they helped save a nation. The code was never broken. Thousands of messages were sent. Urgent orders, desperate pleas, coordinates for firepower, and not a single one was ever deciphered by the Japanese. That fact alone makes the Navajo Code one of the most successful codes in military history. But beyond its military success, the code symbolizes something deeper. It shows that language is power. Words carry more than meaning. They carry culture, memory, and strength. For the Navajo, their mother tongue, once ridiculed, became the shield for thousands of Marines. Every time a code talker pressed the radio button and spoke in Navajo, he proved that identity can be a weapon of survival. Yet the legacy is not without its shadows. Many code talkers returned home with scars that never healed. They carried memories of blood-soaked beaches, of comrades who never returned, of voices silenced by gunfire. Some found healing in recognition later in life. Others struggled until the end, weighed down by what they had seen and endured. Their story is not one of triumph alone, but also of sacrifice. The medals, parades, and monuments came late. But they did come, and for the families, the recognition meant the world. Grandchildren could finally say with pride, "My grandfather was a code talker. He helped win the war today." Statues and memorials stand across America in their honor. In Window Rock, Arizona, the Navajo Nation's capital, a bronze statue depicts two code talkers with radios, frozen in the act of transmitting the words that changed history. Schools bear their name, students learn their story, and their voices live on in recordings and interviews, preserved for generations. But perhaps their greatest legacy is less tangible. It is the reminder that greatness often comes from unexpected places, that in moments of crisis, it is not always the largest armies or the most advanced machines that carry the day. Sometimes it is the quiet strength of a people who refuse to let their language die. The Navajo Code Talkers were Marines, warriors, and heroes. But above all, they were young men who stepped forward when their nation needed them most. They left behind their homes, carried their language into battle, and gave everything they had. Generals never expected native soldiers to win the war with words. But they did. And in doing so, they left a mark on history that will never fade. Their story is not just about the past. It is about resilience, identity, and the enduring power of language. It is a reminder that even in the darkest times, voices can become weapons, and words can save lives. So the next time you hear Navajo spoken, remember, These were the words that silenced the enemy. These were the words that carried victory.